Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast. I'm your co-host, Ben Scallon, and with me is my loyal compatriot, Jason Osborne. I was going to say I'm the host and you're the co-host, but that was just like the way it was going to
Uh,
come out of my mouth initially. But that sounds a little bit too
it's like an
Batman and Robin-esque.
an
I feel like
on-air,
we
an
are
on-air
peers and
demotion.
equals. Yeah, no,
See,
I didn't want to break it to you that way. That was a little bit abrupt way to find that out.
yeah. Well, to
So,
be fair, I mean, this is what plenty of people think anyway. It's like, I've often seen the feedback. It's like brilliant work. Yeah, as I said before, brilliant work, Ben and co. Or you see people saying that lad made a good point, even though we're in episode 12 here.
I'm sure as this podcast grows, that will change abruptly.
Uh,
On your behalf, I long for the day when people associate me as, aren't you that guy who used to be on Jason's podcast? And by that point, I'll be
you
left in the
know,
dirt. And
I'm actually more than happy to keep flying under the radar because you keep taking all of the public shit, and I get all of the benefits of being able to do a podcast from my day job while sheltering behind your masculine frame, as I'm sure we're going to get into.
well, indeed. Do we want to jump straight into the toxic masculinity bath that I was bathed in last night on RTE? Is that going to be our opening salvo?
I think it is, and I mean, I don't know about you, but it feels like the country's been talking about toxic masculinity for about a week and a half now, and I mean, in some sense, it has been because when did this latest iteration of it all start? It was when Conor McGregor appeared in the White House, and then Andrew Tate posted on X at Simon Harris, wasn't I think that was it, and then obviously John and Sarah discussed it on their podcast last week, and I think we'll open it up with you were on up front with Katie Hannon last night where they were discussing toxic masculinity, and you're getting a lot of good feedback from that. So how did that conversation go from your perspective, and what did it tell you about our toxic masculinity?
Yeah, the point of the show, the reason that they held it ostensibly was to discuss toxic masculinity, but also it was about this show that's on Netflix. It's like a mini series with 4 episodes, each about an hour long, called Adolescence. And it's essentially, I'm going to spoil it, but this isn't really a spoiler. It's pretty much revealed in the first episode. And if you know anything about the show, you'll already know this. That long story short, this 13-year-old boy gets rejected by a girl. He's kind of an incel, and so he stabs her and kills her. And then he's going through the court process, and it's just a drama around that. It's fictitious. It's not a real story. It's just like a piece of media and art. And I might piss a couple of people off by saying this because I had heard all of these right wing takes ahead of time, people who would be sort of on our side, quote unquote, of the political spectrum, or people who I'd generally be aligned with on most things, saying, oh, this thing is terrible. It's a piece of liberal woke propaganda. It's demonizing all young men. Bah, 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 bah. And so that's kind of what I went into it expecting. And then having watched it, I really didn't think it was that objectionable. It was quite good from the perspective of the acting, like it was engaging to watch. It was
Mm.
compelling. And as I say, it's a work of fiction. But the issue I had and the angle I was coming at it on the show from the discussion we had was Simon Harris and other people have started saying this needs to be compulsory viewing in all schools, and that's where I get off. That's where I go. Okay, look, it's fine. It's a good series or whatever. It's entertaining. Not entertaining is the wrong word. It's obviously a dark subject matter, but you know what I mean. Like it holds your attention.
Yeah.
But to insinuate that all young boys are potentially incel murderers who are going to stab a girl because they got rejected is a gross smear against 50% of the population. So that was sort of the angle I wanted to come at it from. And so I think I did a reasonably okay job
No,
of articulating that view.
I think that was very much the feedback that I saw on it. I mean, this isn't the Ben Scallon ass kissing session here or anything like this, but I think it's not hard when you're sort of up against some of the competition that you are on the show. I mean, maybe get into one of the comments one of the other panelists made shortly, but as we sort of discuss what exactly toxic masculinity might be. But just on the show, I agree, I haven't watched it yet. I should mention that initially. But I learned this lesson a couple of years ago that on either side, you have this cohort of people who are very quick to jump to outrage. And, there is a perspective from which that's valid. Like, for example, I think the best sort of base from which to be outraged regarding this adolescence show is, as you say, when politicians start using it as a battering ram for discussing issues the way they want to discuss them. Because as egregious maybe as I think Simon Harris's comments were, they had it much worse in the UK when Keir Starmer was talking about how this has to. I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but it was essentially they were thrusting at this has to start a national conversation in the UK over the influences that our young men are being exposed to on
And you kind of want to say in response to that, you guys know it's not real, right? This is
yeah.
fictitious. This is like we watched the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then we have to have a national conversation about
Fat
people getting
guys with
killed with
chainsaws.
chainsaws.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's a movie, guys. It's you could say what you want about it, but it's not something that is happening at epidemic levels. I'm not saying no young guy has ever gone off the rails and done something drastic. That's obviously true, but it's not to the point where it needs to be shown in every single classroom because there's so many people who are at risk of doing that. It's just not credible.
And here we'll get into the essence of it, which is that I have a massive issue with the toxic masculinity discussion because I think it's a way more harmful discussion than it is helpful. If it was, if there was any degree of helpfulness to it, and I don't think there is, because for a couple of reasons. One is that all proponents of the idea of toxic masculinity are either very confused or very vague in that anything they will describe as toxically masculine could really be applied to anyone. It's just being a bad person. It's just a lot of the time they've identified a man they don't like and they're like, okay, this is toxic masculinity. And it's like, I don't know, take the examples of Conor McGregor, Andrew Tate, and all of these guys. These are guys who, by virtue of having had careers in combat, being outspoken, they embody, traditionally masculine things like aggressiveness, assertiveness, things like this. And I suppose people see that and they say, okay, well, this is an example of toxic masculinity because they sort of embody these things and they're just, they're doing bad things. But the thing is, it's like, well, but there's loads of guys who embody those same things, but they don't do these things. It's like you've got, I don't know, for every person you might want to describe as toxically masculine, say, you have like 100, 1,000 other people who are putting their masculine traits to good use as fathers, as husbands, as sons, brothers, people in their workplaces, all of these kind of things. And I just feel like toxic masculinity is a classic example of having a conversation with a broad stroke brush that doesn't really tell you anything useful. And at the same time, it does massive damage because whether they intend it or not, and I actually think some of them probably do intend it, you're associating masculinity with negative sentiment. And I think that is having concrete effects. Like you see it, and I think, again, I'm not going to excuse instances of genuine bad behavior here, but I do think there's lots of examples of when people are neglected or abused, and it's much worse when it's on an individual case and it's happening directly to a person. But it does sort of broaden out to a societal level when young men in particular are told they're constantly hearing about toxic masculinity. It's common sense that's not good for them.
Yeah, I think as well. And I really wanted to make this point on the show. I actually had a load of points that I wanted to make that I didn't get a chance to because I thought the show was going to go on for much longer. I had assumed we were going to get to certain topics that we didn't. So I was keeping them in reserve. Had I known how short the time was, I probably would have forced them and interjected, but it just didn't pan out that way. But one of the points I wanted to make was we're here talking about toxic masculinity and what are negative masculine traits and bad manifestations of manliness. And I hate to bring the conversation back to this topic every single time because I don't want to talk about it all the time. And, we get accused of being obsessed or something. But I really do think in this instance, it's relevant that most of the people on the panel who I was debating are strong proponents of gender ideology,
Mhm.
which means that you don't even know what a man is or a woman is. You don't even
Yeah.
believe in that as a definitive, concrete concept rooted in physical reality. You think it's all a social construct and it's just sort of a nebulous convention that we've come up with as a society. So, of course, you don't think masculinity and toxic forms of that are good. I'd love you to define what is a good manifestation of masculinity or what is masculinity at all in the first place. I guarantee you they couldn't, and that's a fundamental weakness in their worldview, which I would have loved to talk about, but as I said, that just wasn't
No,
logistically possible.
that's dead right, and I think your point was very good because I think you have to sort of get into concrete, and this is the thing because a lot of the people who are proponents of sort of toxic masculinity talking points are also often people, as you say, who are sympathetic to gender ideologies talking points, and these people are people, particularly who are proponents of that, are fundamentally detached from reality. A lot of them don't think there's a difference between men and women, and it's like how the hell are you going to talk about toxic masculinity if you can't even, as you say, establish what that is? So, in talking about these things, you have to kind of go back to basics, which is that, okay, you clearly have men, you're a man, I'm a man. You clearly have women. You have to be able to acknowledge those are different things. And then you have to hone in on it's like, okay, what is this one like men say? What are they good at? And those are the things that constitute masculinity, or what are they sort of predominantly what do they predominantly do in human society? What are they predisposed to? And then you look at women and it's like, what do they predominantly do? What are they predisposed to? And that sort of, it's a complex topic, but that sort of generally makes up masculinity and femininity. And I thought your point was very good on the show that someone breaks into your house, everyone is just sort of unconsciously going to expect the man to be the one to address that, to get up. And I know you were taking some taking some flack because you said grab a baseball bat, and all the nationalists
Yeah,
were like,
yeah.
"Don't you
People
mean a
people were
hurl?"
freaking out on Twitter. People were freaking out on Twitter because I said like my go-to home defense weapon that occurred to me was a baseball bat. And people were saying, "Oh, this guy's an Americanized Yank, and why wouldn't you say a hurl or something like that, or a hammer or something?" And I'm like, first of all, people do have baseball bats in Ireland. Like people play rounders, and so I had a baseball bat growing up in my house for various bits. You know what I mean? Like that's not a weird.
Yeah,
It's not like I said pull out your lightsaber or something. Like it wasn't.
yeah.
You swear it was the most off the wall concept I'd ever. But anyway, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's this idea that because it's always very difficult when you get into because the difficulty with toxic masculinity is that you're trying to say that well, we're going to go to a more fundamental level. A lot of this comes down to worldview, I think, which is that I would say a good man. So I would say you can be an instantiation of a man without necessarily being good or bad. I think those things are fairly sort of amoral, to put it that way. Like I think that aggression, assertiveness, a lot of these other things that are traditionally associated with masculinity can go in either direction. And I think a lot of the time we call toxic masculinity when they go in a, because I do think there's something to some of the claims of it. For example, that might be an unpopular statement, but I'm no fan of Andrew Tate, and I'm also not a particular fan of Conor McGregor either. And so I think there's something to it, but I think the difficulty is that you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater with all of this, which is that actually aggression is a very good thing when it's put to good use. It's like that's why there's humans around today. If men weren't aggressive, you presume tribes of people would have been just slaughtered by wildlife and by rival bands and things like this as they developed throughout history. So I think then what would be a much more fruitful conversation for us to be having around masculinity and things is a question of virtue. It's like, well, okay, what constitutes a virtuous man? Because by that standard, then you can talk about what constitutes toxic or whatever. But we're so far from that conversation. I don't even know how we get there because that requires a sort of shared worldview in which you all acknowledge the same good.
Well, I'll tell you how far we are from that conversation. As people will know if they've watched the show, I had pushback on my definition of masculinity because, similar to what we're talking about, I was asked, what is a man? What is masculinity in your view? And so I defined it as being willing and able to use your strength to protect those who are less capable of defending themselves. You know, you think men giving up their seat on the lifeboat when the Titanic was going down to save women and children, men running into burning buildings, men in their household fighting off home intruders, things like that. That's masculinity in a nutshell to me. And so that's why I would not define the kind of toxic red pill stuff, which is all about utilizing women to further your own position in life and trying to manipulate them. That's the exact inverse and opposite of masculinity, so far as I'm concerned, because masculinity is supposed to be self-sacrificial. I mean, not that we get accused of being like, you know, theological headbangers and going on about religion all the time. So this will probably irritate people and I won't dwell too much on it. But I think about, you know, Jesus Christ giving his life on the cross as like the prime example of heroism and, you know, the most manly act that was ever
Mm.
committed in human history. This guy being willing to sacrifice himself for the good of his loved ones. That was the symbol and the pinnacle. So that's the kind of perspective I'd be coming from. But anyway, with all that said, I had some pushback from one of my co-panelists, Owen Cleary, who's a teacher, and he was asked if he agreed with me. Do you think masculinity is about protection? And I have the quote here. He said, "I don't want to be called on to protect the women in my life," and he essentially said, and I don't want to straw man him either. You know, I want to
I
articulate
know.
his view accurately. His position was effectively that I want women to be autonomous enough and empowered enough that they don't even need me. They can provide for themselves financially. They have a good job, and you know they're able to work hard, and even that they can provide for me sometimes. They have such abundance, and that they don't. We live in such a safe world, and there's so little danger and crime that they don't even need me to protect them because they're so sorted. That sort of a way. That seemed to be the angle he was coming from. And first of all, I was delighted when he said that because usually I have to take the controversial position on these shows. So I'm glad I was able to outsource that to him and give me a break for once, where I can just defend the common sense view that 99% of the human race agrees with. Because I just find it absurd that, you know, women have an expectation of what they think men in their life should do, and that involves providing and protecting. Of course, many women work, many women have to work, many women want to work, and that's fine. But I think the vast majority of women, if you said to them, "Do you have?" I mean, let's not even make it about women. Most people don't like their job. It's very rare that you have people who do their job because they love it and they're really passionate about it, and you know they do it for free even if they weren't being paid. I love my job personally, but a lot of people, it's just a paycheck, it's just a means to an end. They're not too thrilled about it, and they wouldn't do it if they could do something else. So
Mhm.
from that perspective, I fundamentally believe a lot of women, if you ask them, "Hey, this guy will who you love will take care of you and provide for you and so on, and you don't have to work anymore." I think they would take that option. I think women, if a burglar broke into the house and their man didn't step up to defend the family, I think that would irreparably destroy the relationship because it's an expectation that women have of men, as they should, you know, and the vast majority of men would also step up in those situations. So I
Yeah.
think his idea, I think what he's suggesting isn't even an attractive prospect to women, let alone to young men.
Well, what, and again, I don't want to talk too much about his statement without him being here, obviously, to, you know, make his own points or anything like this. But I would say that I sort of see in what he was saying a current that you see elsewhere, and it is this kind of, it certainly is a kind of reforming idea in that it goes against very much what people have thought about these things for you know thousands of years, essentially. I'm sure he would probably, and other people would probably push back on that and say, well, actually, no, there's currents of my thought and all of these different cultures and whatnot. But I think by and large, people would say the vast majority of people have thought as we think for most of human history. And a large part of what this neglects is that, and again, this goes back to the whole gender confusion, which is that uh, sex is a dual thing. Like, and you might say, sex is obviously the biological reality of it, whereas, gender is kind of all the social side of things or the psychological side that come along with this. There's something to that. But a lot of that
But
comes
I'm
about.
sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. And I know that's not your main point. You're building to your point, but
Mm.
also just to say, the biological reality and this psychological are interconnected in the sense that
Exactly.
the reason men have the behaviors that they do, in part, like the reason men are aggressive, is because of testosterone. Like if women start taking
Because they're
testosterone,
stronger, yeah.
they they start to so like to try and separate it and say, oh no, the physical and the psychological are totally two different things. That's actually not a
Yeah.
reasonable way to go about it. But I know you're not doing that anyways. Apologies, go on.
No, 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 that's exactly right. And it's a good point to make as well. It's like any attempts to separate gender from sex insofar as those are two valid categories is very much an agenda-driven thing because they're inseparably linked. It's not like these sort of social roles men have came out of nowhere. It's like they came out of, what men are, and the same way that, these female social roles didn't come out of nowhere, they came out of what women are. But the point I was going to make is that it's also the case that these roles are defined in relation to the other sex. It's like, you know, if women were all out doing, say, what men have been doing for forever, masculinity wouldn't be such a sort of defined or clear thing. In the same way that if men had been doing forever what women have been doing, their femininity and say that wouldn't be such a clear thing either. So they are defined in relation to each other. And this idea that how was it he put it? Yeah, he would like sort of support a society such that women might be able to provide for themselves and provide for him ultimately. It kind of I don't know. Yeah, kind of. It just, I suppose, it neglects that there is another side to this. It's like, okay, this might be your sort of your understanding of modern masculinity own, but women very much think differently and they require differently as well, in the same way that men require differently from women. I mean, I think we'd make good roommates, Ben, but I don't think we would make particularly good life partners, you and I. I think our wives are much better suited to that role than another man would be. But it's
Yeah,
a
thank God this podcast is only once a week because I don't think I could manage more than that, to be honest.
well, other than that, then we would get into the territory of proper toxic masculinity. But another point that I just wanted to make quickly, and I don't know what you think about this, is that if it's valid to talk about toxic masculinity, why the hell isn't it valid to talk about toxic femininity? And I know John made this point in an article during the week, and he spoke about examples of toxic femininity that he used were, I don't know, an example like if I remember correctly, he used Lily Phillips or something like this, someone who sort of tries to appeal to the most base instincts in men and things like that. And I actually think that's a sort of bad example of toxic femininity, because I think Lily Phillips is an example of the end product of unhinged feminism, where her sexuality has been totally divorced from procreation, which is in reality, sexuality can't be divorced from that. And she's essentially living her sexuality as a man, but she's a woman. But I think, say, and this is going to get into really taboo territory, so, this may well be clipped and people can hate me if they want. But I do think that, like, say, toxic femininity might be an example of something like suicidal empathy. And Jordan Peterson, I think, is very good on this. Suicidal empathy that would try to welcome and integrate things that are dangerous to you and to the people around you. Like, he uses obviously he's all into the Genesis tale, and I think a lot of his reading of this stuff is lacking, but I think he was very good on the story of Adam and Eve, about how, like, one of Eve's great sins was that she listened to the snake and she was like, oh, okay, this is something that can be trusted and I can sort of take its advice and welcome it to everything else. Like, I can bring this to my partner Adam, and that's all fine. And it's like, whereas, so he's taking a psychological reading of these things. But I do think that sort of applies to modern society, such that you look at, I think a lot of people would say that there's been no, and indeed Sarah said it on hers and John's podcast, that there's never been a better time to be a woman. Women have a greater platform than ever before. And of course, that's affected sort of politics and our cultural approach to things. And you might say that, there's a lot of people have said and would say that our inability to sort of draw a harder line on various things is what's contributing in some ways to our societal issues at the moment. Now, I'm obviously not blaming women for this or anything like this, but I am saying that if it's possible for masculinity to get out of whack, which is what a lot of people are suggesting, it is possible for femininity to get out of whack as well, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, to take an anecdotal example, of course, there's just one interaction between a man and a woman, but like my wife is aligned with me on pretty much everything views wise. We just see eye to eye, which is why we're married. You know, you meet people, you get along with them, you have similar values, and so that's the basis. That's not the basis of the relationship, but that's a part of the relationship is that you get along and you're not constantly arguing over dumb minutia. So we would see eye to eye on things like immigration and so on. But I remember we were having a discussion about illegal immigration, and I was talking about how, in my view, if you break the law, I don't care what the circumstances are. I don't care how long you've been here working, contributing, or whatever. I think rules are rules, and they have to be enforced ruthlessly, and with no sort of exceptions because it's this sob story or I have this kind of pretty much 100% of the time I think deportation is the right thing to do, because if somebody doesn't have a right to be here, why should they be here? And my wife was telling me how intellectually she understands that argument and she kind of feels that's probably right, her instincts would lead her that way, but she said that she would really struggle to make that decision if she was in a decision making position, if she was the minister, or if she was a Garda or something like that, because she would feel empathy and nuance. And I'm not saying I don't feel empathy, obviously men have empathy too, but and I'm not even saying she's wrong. I mean, maybe she's right. Maybe a more nuanced approach is correct. But yeah, I do think it's an interesting difference between men and women, that I think a lot of men will be a lot more ruthless when it comes to decisions
Yeah.
like that, and sometimes you need that ruthlessness. Sometimes that's a necessary part of holding your society together, and I think women will be much more likely to uh you know call for clemency
Yeah.
in those kinds of situations.
And I know we spend a lot of time on this topic, so we probably want to move on now in a second. But I would just make the additional point that the thing is, yeah, talking about masculinity and femininity, these aren't like hard set things either. Because I agree entirely with what you've said, and I think, like, generally speaking, that's absolutely true. I would nearly offer myself up here as a in my relationship with my wife. My wife, as I've said probably a couple of times before, and this is Polish, and Poles are super direct. And so there's some ways in which my wife, funny enough, embodies more sort of traditionally masculine things, like sort of being confrontational and being direct, and sort of being, pretty happy to stick by sort of, just rules kind of thinking, than I nearly would be, because I think I'm a pretty sort of agreeable person, and it does require some effort on my part to be disagreeable and things like that. So you might say, because I know opponents of, traditional masculinity are always saying, like, what about the exceptions? What about the guy who doesn't feel like a, a traditional man or whatever? It's like, there's some ways in which none of us are the traditional man. There's some ways in which none of us are the traditional woman. It's like, doesn't mean you're not a man, or doesn't mean you're not a woman. And the difficulty is that people have tried to rewrite what masculinity and femininity are to fit everything. And it's like, no, you have to acknowledge that there's these baselines on both sides, and variance is fine. But more, generally speaking, you fit into these patterns as men and women. So I just feel like, again, a lot of this discussion around toxic masculinity is coming from the place that we've been for the past couple of years, which is, essentially totally unmoored from reality on these topics. But I see we sort of get on a little bit with this, so maybe we might want to move on, unless you wanted to make another point.
No, no, I'm happy to move on. I'll just very briefly say, inevitably we're going to get people freaking out in the comments, going, "What are you talking about? My auntie is this, or my mother's a girl boss, or I'm a woman." And like, we get all of that. Okay, there's, as Jason says, there's exceptions to every rule. We're talking about billions and billions of people. We're talking about the entire human race. So we are deriving patterns from what we've experienced. In general, in my experience, when there's a spider in the bath, a man is the one who's called to get it away because women find insects yucky. That's not always the case. Some women have no problem getting rid of spiders and it's fine. And maybe you're one of those women. That's okay. We're talking about the overall trend. If we did a statistical analysis of all the households in Ireland, what is the overall trend? So we don't need to panic and start freaking out about the edge cases, which we are sure exist. So with that said, will we kick off our next topic? What do we have next on the agenda? I've even forgotten. We got
What we have
really heavily
next,
into that. That took up half the show.
we did, yeah, and I mean, you could go on about it forever, and there's a sense in which those discussions are always going to be theoretical. But there is a
I,
funny
I
sense in
didn't
which
I didn't even I didn't even get to mention how Muammar Gaddafi had this specific branch of his bodyguard, which was called the Amazonian Guard, and they were all comprised of female models carrying machine guns. So you'll see him when he was alive walking along, and he's flanked by beautiful women with makeup and rifles who are his security detail. Not sure how practical it is, but it sure looked cool. So I just wanted to
it's
throw
like
that out there.
that's where these things break down. Is like, is that toxic masculinity or toxic femininity? It's like, does any of this stuff make sense? But
Yeah, we're really blurring the lines there.
but no, what we wanted to discuss next is and moving from toxic masculinity and toxic femininity to just toxic everyone and everything, is poor old Garron Noone, because this all sort of kicked off, I think, after we had recorded our podcast last week, and it sort of neatly wrapped up either this morning or yesterday evening. So we figured it was timely to discuss, because it's a funny country we live in that one lad deleting his social media can sort of capture the national attention for the span of a couple of days. But I'll offer my 2 cents on it while I have the floor. I don't know what this was all about. He said completely reasonable things. I can understand maybe why he wanted to step back, because social media can be exhausting. And when you've got, thousands of people, as it was in his case, talking about you, why not turn things off for a couple of days? But the fact that I actually think, not that I'm his advisor, and I don't think he's disgraced himself or anything like this, but I think a sort of follow-up statement that he made or video that he put out was pretty unnecessary. I would have just reactivated and gone back to business as usual if I were him.
Yeah, you see, I'm sure it probably gave him whiplash in the sense that people like us are used to getting constant criticisms and attacks all the time. Like it's I just expect at this point, my skin is thicker than an elephant's nutsack in the sense that I know at any given moment of the day, there are people who are saying horrific things about me. And that's just like something that's been the case for years. So eventually you just tune it out and you don't care if you ever cared at all to begin with. Whereas if you are a fairly inoffensive content creator like him, who's just, what does he even do? Food, it was not food reviews. It was like music or
music
comedy.
and sort of comedic videos and things. I've only seen a few of them. I don't have Instagram, so I don't follow them, or TikTok, so I see them come up on X from time to time. But yeah, it seems to be, as I say,
it seems to be all very like middle of the road. Not, I'm not saying it's bad or anything, not at all. I'm just saying, like, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that's going to piss people off. Or
well, that was why he was so beloved.
Controversial.
Like, it's pretty middle of the road stuff that everyone can get behind. Like, because to be fair, he wasn't like that wall at this drove me bloody nuts. This wall at Dublin Airport that had all these Irishisms that I thought were, every time I saw them, I wanted to die. I was like, oh, did I leave the immersion on? I can't wait to get myself a pack of Tato and things like this. It wasn't of that par, but it was the same sort of tuned into the same kind of, oh, we have all these things in common that a lot of people seem to like on, as if you might say, on both the right and the left. So that's why he was beloved, and I think maybe why it made such big waves when he decided to voice his opinion on so contentious a topic as immigration.
You know, his case and the case I'm about to mention are totally unrelated, but I was very interested in the timing that there was this, I've even forgotten his name, it's not coming to me now, but people know who I'm talking about, that there was this Waterford garage owner who was an influencer on TikTok. He had a whole TikTok account with like 20 or 30,000 followers where he's there talking about selling cars and buying cars and what kind of car should you buy and what should you look out for when buying a car, that kind of thing. Nothing political about him. And then he came out to say that the Department of Social Protection was paying for Ukrainians to have their cars repaired. And you can tell from the way he's talking, he is an absolute normie. And I don't mean that in any kind of a pejorative sense. I just mean like this is not a guy who's in political circles. He's just a guy who is just going about his day-to-day business. And he just noticed something that he thought was weird and he wanted to talk about it. And that ended up exploding. And like he got a lot of support, but he got a lot of abuse too. And he didn't take it down or take it back. But he said after he published that video, he goes, okay, now I'm kind of retreating back from that was my 2 cents on something that was happening, and that's not what I'm about, and I don't want to become an activist, and I'm I don't take it back, but I'm
Mm,
bowing out now at this point. And then around that same time, we have Garron Noone, who's just like your ordinary comedian, apolitical guy. He makes this video, and then suddenly all hell breaks loose. So it seems like I don't know if that's a coincidence, but it's weird that we would have multiple normal, very ordinary people who don't have any kind of political axe to grind, who aren't in the trenches like you and me,
mm.
coming to these conclusions and then being horribly attacked for it. I don't know if that kind of impacts on how they and people like them are going to think about these issues going forward. That it's like, damn, you can't even like. It's one thing if you're attacking the far right, quote unquote. I'm just like a normal person. I don't have any kind of crazy views. I
Yeah.
articulated a view that I've heard a million times down the pub, and suddenly people are jumping down my throat. What the hell is this? You know?
No, I don't I think these are very interesting cases because these guys clearly said these things. It's come to a stage now where immigration, and we've seen it in poll after poll, that immigration is something that the vast majority of people feel the government of Ireland does not have a handle on. And for a long time, that was completely taboo to say, whereas we've clearly gotten to a place where if these apolitical guys feel like they're able to say it to their pretty big platforms, it's come to a place where, and again, there was another good point made in one of the articles that was on our website this week about how immigration has become, it's widely understood now that there's dissatisfaction with the way immigration is being handled in Ireland. If the government is able to adjust its messaging such that it wants it to be known that the vast majority of asylum applications are being rejected at the first instance, that's because they've sort of seen the room temperature and they're like, okay, this is what the vast majority of people want to hear now. I think if Garron Noone and this mechanic whose name also escapes me feel like they're able to say that to their big platforms, what are people saying who don't have these big platforms? What are the vast majority of Irish people saying in their conversations with one another in shops and pubs, in each other's houses and things like this? And I mean, you and I would both have a sense of that because we talk to lots of people. And I have friends who are, yeah, again, not to use this pejoratively, but just to sort of to know people who aren't involved in these discussions, who will come to me and say, oh, it's crazy, and they won't really go beyond these generalities. They just say, oh, it's crazy, like, but it's this general sentiment. So I think these instances have been very indicative of the way in which public conversation has gone and the way sort of Irish immigration system skepticism has become the norm now rather than the exception. I think the only way you're going to experience the kickback Garron Noone did and this mechanic did is if you're online. And I think that says something in and of itself.
Yeah, it really does show, I think, that the government has lost the argument. And that's not to say that the issue is resolved, far from it. Obviously, there's still a major problem with immigration and the way it's being run. But it's funny, as exactly as you say, that everyone now accepts it's a piss take. Like I saw Sinn Féin put out a press release with that. We I don't know if we talked about him on the show, but the guy Randy Gladstone,
Oh, we did, yeah.
I think we discussed him last week. Who for just 10-second recap for people who don't know or don't remember. The long story short, this Guyanese guy who had 19 previous convictions in the UK, including for rape, and who was actually barred from entering Britain. He came here and within a couple of days raped an 18-year-old girl in this country. So we knew he was a scumbag. He had a clear record in our neighboring jurisdiction of being a bad egg. We let him in, and almost immediately he attacked somebody. And so he's been convicted now and sentenced to 10 years in prison and yada yada. But the point remains, Sinn Féin put out a press release when this happened saying this is an outrage and the government needs to explain how and why this individual was allowed into the country and blah, blah, blah. So when you've even got the political left opposition who are willing to ask questions like, why was this guy in the country? And of course, it's an extreme case. I think it shows just how not controversial that is now and how far the conversation has moved along.
Absolutely. And I also think, though, that particularly the Garron Noone case is an example of something you and I were just discussing recently about how what will make a society infinitely more inhabitable place will be when we start being bloody charitable with people. And this applies to both sides of the political spectrum. And this is going to be a very unpopular point to make because a lot of people will point the finger at the other side and say, but they're trying to destroy us. Why the hell would I be, charitable towards this person? And it's like, well, fine, that's your opinion. It's not mine. Say, I think this is what's going to make society better is when people start embodying virtue. And one of the elements of that is being charitable, say, with what other people have to say. I think it's kind of obvious to me that's the only way in which a pleasant society can function. And it's like, it should have been obvious that Garron Noone is a reasonable guy, that when he says things like this, he isn't advocating anything nuts. He isn't expressing anything beyond the pale, to put it that way. And yet, clearly, and admittedly, it was, you would say, sort of people on the far left who were taking issue with what he had to say. But it's like, we really need to get back to a place where people are given the benefit of the doubt when they say things, such that, like, if you say something like he said, you assume that he's a normal person who's expressing something normal rather than, expressing some mad view that's beyond the pale. And I do think that, over time we'll move back in that direction, but clearly based on this, we're not there yet.
And I would also say briefly that some people in reaction to stories like this will say things like, oh, you see, there's no point being reasonable because he was reasonable or that person was reasonable and they still got attacked. So I might as well throw caution to the wind and just be a nut job and just say, outlandish, shocking things for inflammatory purposes because it makes no difference either way. They're going to call me names regardless. And, excuse me, that's totally flawed thinking for the simple reason that it is, of course, right that you will be attacked regardless if you dissent from the mainstream. That is absolutely true, as we have seen. The difference is whether that attack is credible. When people attack Garron Noone and say, this guy is a nutcase, he's advocating for all kinds of craziness, blah, 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 no one takes that seriously. And other than the small group of shrieking maniacs, probably on the Ireland subreddit or, these sorts of different fringe silos, the vast majority of people watching the situation go, what the hell are you going in on him for? I agree with him. He didn't say anything that mad. Whereas if you're jumping up and down like a freak, saying things that are needlessly offensive, then when people go, this person's an extremist, this person is radical, then ordinary people who aren't clued in will look at it and go, yeah, he kind of sounds like he is, so fair enough. And then it doesn't have, so whether you get attacked or not is not in question. You will, of course, be attacked. The question is whether or not the attack sticks and sounds believable. So there's no need to make it more credible and help your opponent paint you with a head case, basically.
Yeah, well, maybe speaking of jumping up and down like a freak, because I'm just aware that, well, I wouldn't say we're on the clock. People might think that, someone's got a gun to our backs here when we're talking this, but we do like to provide a sort of snappy podcast for people. You were covering the Dáil speaking right scandal today. I can't even get the bloody name of the thing right because it's so boring and sprawling. Ben, would you be so kind as to give me and the viewers the lowdown on this and what you make of it?
You see, I can, but will I, is the question. Because does anyone want to hear about the Dáil speaking rights scandal? Like if anybody who's been kind of tangentially following it knows this all started because you had the regional independent group and I'm literally boring myself as I explain this, but the regional independent group of independent TDs who rode in with the government, they're part of the government, like Michael Lowry and these sorts of people, and they wanted to form a technical group, which is usually reserved for the opposition, so that they would have more speaking time. And then people were freaking out saying this is totally unreasonable because then you have effectively government TDs eating into the opposition speaking time, which I happen to agree with, by the way. I think the opposition are right and they have a good point in their objection.
Mm.
But this has been going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Like, how many months now are we into the year? Like, we're coming up to, it's going to be April soon. This is still going on. It's paralyzed the legislature, so nothing significant can happen. How many newspaper articles have been printed about this? How much discussion have we had? And just today, because the government have proposed a solution which the opposition are not happy with, they're proposing having like several minutes each week where government backbenchers will be allowed to speak, and also non-aligned TDs. Like, I could get into all of it and explain it. I honestly think it'll go in one ear and out the other, and nobody cares, because the point of the matter is the opposition had a screaming conniption fit and melted down, and Verona Murphy did a terrible job as the Cahirlock of managing the room and trying to keep everybody like, when you're in school and you have a teacher who's like, I'm gonna count to three, and no one listens because that nothing's gonna happen on three and it's just an impotent threat. It had that kind of energy to it.
Come on, guys.
And
I'm
anyway,
gonna get really mad this time.
exactly, yeah. You're like, yeah, I'm sure that's really gonna hit
That's
them where
really
it
gonna.
hurts. And I like Verona Murphy, by the way. I'm not criticizing her, but it's just like, maybe there's a good reason for it. Maybe if I was in her position, I would know why this is the case. But she has the power to expel people. Maybe she would say, "Oh well, everyone was screaming, so I'd end up expelling like 70% of the chamber." Okay, fair enough. Maybe that would be a bad look or something. I don't know. But yeah, the point is, it's gotten to the stage where I don't think most people care, and they just want it to be resolved one way or the other. I don't even care who wins anymore. Initially, I was with the opposition. I kind of see their point more than the government's point, and I say, yeah, I think they're in the right, but I don't care enough to turn it into a several month saga where
Yeah.
nothing gets done. Like, can we move it along, please, one way or another? It's really getting pathetic.
The opposition in Ireland, in this government and in the last, are just exceptional at when it comes to their inability to pick issues that the public cares about. I mean, as has been pointed out many times elsewhere, why they haven't, put their foot down like this when it comes to issues people actually care about, say, and said, we're not going to move until there's some sort of movement on, whether it be immigration, whether it be healthcare, whether it be housing, and whatever way they would do that. This is the hill they decide to die on. It's like speaking rights in the Dáil, and it's like, okay, you might feel it's important, and there's a minor level on which it is important, but I call it and I wouldn't have said minor before, like yourself, but I say minor now because in comparison to the absolute mess that we're being presented with frequently in the Dáil chamber, it is minor. It's like, would you guys just please get on with things?
Look, we're just after finding out that Trump could be about to rip the ass out of the Irish economy with a tariff war that's about to be launched, which could decimate our entire economic model and plunge the country into poverty. Maybe that's worth talking about instead of who gets to talk when and who gets a couple of minutes extra speaking time here or there. Like, is this really top of the agenda for you maniacs?
Well,
like, what are we actually doing here?
This is what I wanted to say about this, which is that, it may well be the case that this is deeply frustrating for all of us to watch and deeply boring to follow in the news, but there is a sense in which it's also deeply symbolic in that, number one, it's completely symbolic of the absolute state of dysfunction that government finds itself in at the moment. Number two, I also think it's sort of symbolic of a lot of the pettiness that goes on in government. Like, I have got a chuckle on recent occasions of imagining them all, around the corridors of Leinster House, talking about how many minutes we're getting, how many minutes do you think we can eke out of them here and there. And it's like, this stuff is also inane at this stage that it's supremely frustrating, and it's also supremely unedifying. It's like you've heard it said many times over the years that these are the people governing the country. But I really feel like this is an instance where it's like, I believe we put up a video of the chaos in the Dáil chamber today, and it's just, it's hard to fathom, I suppose, that these are the people who were voted for. What is it, not even 5 months ago now? It's an absolute farce, and if things weren't to get back to normal after this display, you would think probably no harm. It's just it's extraordinarily tedious for it to keep coming up in the news cycle.
Yeah, yeah. If I never hear another word about the speaking rights issue, I will die a happy man because it's just like because like my understanding is that the government say the government's line on this is that they're not even going to be taking away any opposition speaking time. They're just going to add more speaking slots that will be available to backbenchers and people like Mike Clone, Owen Hayes, formerly of the Social Democrat, who got kicked out, who's kind of fallen between the cracks. And I strongly support him getting more speaking time because he's my proxy in there. I need to have a voice myself. So we can't not have Ben Scallon
Agent
representation in.
agent number two.
Exactly, yeah, somebody said today I was on the plinth outside Leinster House, and Patter was coming up with one of the other AIM2 representatives, and somebody said, "Is this AIM1 or AIM2 or something like that?" I forget. Anyway, that's such a stupid joke, but it made me cackle. Um, but yeah, anyway, long story short, it's all extremely dumb, and like you say, you would never. I've literally never seen them cause so much controversy over any other issue, and this is so minor in the scheme of things that it's beyond a piss take. Yeah, I really hope. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Uh, no, maybe you say what you were going to say. I was going to say it's so boring. I don't even feel like speaking about it any further.
Literally, yeah. This might have been one of the shortest topics we ever discussed, but it's one of those. It's like sometimes I don't know, I'll do something like I'll go out or I'll be in the middle of a process and my wife or somebody will say to me,
Yeah,
"Oh,
yeah.
what are you doing?" And I'll start to explain it. And as the first three words come out of my mouth, I'm like, I'm apathetic about this, so you're not going to care with it.
Well, what I will
Um,
say, and I mean, maybe this is just a cheap talking point, but I do think there has to be provision made somewhere in Dáil proceedings, maybe that if things get hung up for a certain amount of time, we'll reduce pay, TD and cabinet member pay by 50%, and we'll see if that adds a little bit of impetus to get things resolved. Because I find it very hard to believe that if that were the case, we wouldn't have a resolution to this much quicker than we do. As I say, maybe it's just a cheap talking point, but I feel like that would put things on the clock a little bit in a way that there currently is no incentive to do.
yeah, I mean, Micheál Martin made this point, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with them or disagree with them, but I think a lot of people, uh, he was kind of cooking when he said it. Let's put it that way. That
Micheál
he
Martin
he
cooking.
said, yeah, yeah. For once, he said, you guys don't actually want a solution to this. You're loving the fact that it's such a big spectacle. It gives you an excuse to scream and shout and to make a big issue about it and to lambast the government. And that even if there was a perfectly acceptable solution on the table, you would want to drag it out longer just for the spectacle of it. Now, of course, he would say that, and lots of, I no doubt the entire opposition would vehemently deny that and say, absolutely not. It's a critical issue of democracy, blah, blah, blah. And as we've said, I'm more sympathetic to their view than I am to his. But I don't think he's entirely wrong as well at the same time. I do think there is a bit of like grandstanding going on here at this stage,
Yeah, you'd have to wonder if
which
things
they're
would.
great at.
You'd have to wonder if things would go differently if cameras weren't in the chamber and if we weren't all, privy to reporting about what's going on in there.
Like, you ever see that Onion parody video where it's live polling that allows politicians to pander in real time, where as, as you're talking in the debate or whatever, you can see a graph that's updating in real time of where people rank you, kind of thing. And then as you start to discuss a certain issue, it dips. So you have to quickly change what
Yeah, it's
change
like
the
we
subject.
want more minutes. Dips is like we want less minutes.
We want more minutes for our opponents because we want to speak less. That's what I meant to say. Well,
Yeah, but
um,
no, it's an absolutely it's an indictment of the current proceedings, and I mean, what else can we say? But unfortunately, Ireland, this is what we voted for the next 5 years. A great start, but yeah,
That's a great slogan. I like that phrase. This is what we voted for. You can't argue with it. It's just so true, and it's so applicable to so many
and
situations.
I
So
would
with that,
I would just say, and
so
say
go.
we, I say we there in the sense of social solidarity with the rest of my countrymen. I most certainly did not vote for this again.
Yeah, it's a secret ballot, but yeah, I think it's safe to say we did not vote for this, whatever this is. With that said, I know we usually do questions. We will be returning to questions next week. We're under a little bit of time pressure this week, so we have to cut this podcast a little bit shorter than we would like to. So apologies for that, but please keep the questions coming. If you want to leave a question, you can go to gript.ie/questions. The link should be on the page if you're viewing. And if you would like to buy any kind of merchandise, you can go to gript.ie/merch, and the link to that should be available as well. So as I say, apologies for that brief interruption, but we will be returning next week as per usual. Thank you all so much for watching. God bless, and we look forward to seeing you again.
God bless.